The trade winds are swirling again in the Pacific Northwest, but this time it's adding a pass rusher to the edge rushing stable. We'll be breaking it all down here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s who are listening in, whether you're in Des Moines, Washington, or over in Brussels, Belgium. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. The Seahawks getting ready to trim their roster from 90 players to 53, but before they have to get those cuts in tomorrow, Rob, they are adding to the roster. We're going to dive into the move to trade for defensive end Trevis Gipson, and then we are going to have our final 53-man roster projections. We're going to take a deep dive on offense and defense, who we think is going to make the initial roster. That is always a key word here. We know there's going to be changes after the fact, but who we expect to make the initial 53 for the Seahawks. It's going to be a jam-packed episode brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. John Schneider has always been known for making trades in August, but he has taken that habit, that hobby into overdrive this month, Rob, orchestrating what is now his fourth trade of the month this morning, bringing in Trevis Gipson from the Jacksonville Jaguars in exchange for a future 6th-round pick. And ultimately what this ends up playing out as is Darrell Taylor being traded straight up for Trevis Gipson, which if you look at the stats, you wonder if that's necessarily a good move. And yet at the same time, Gipson is a player who has been very productive when he's had his opportunities, and only a few years ago had 7 sacks. He's a bigger bodied guy than Darrell Taylor. So if Mike Macdonald thinks that this player is a good fit, then certainly you're not going to be going against what a defensive-minded coach of his caliber is going to be thinking as far as what he's looking for, that edge position. But there's more to it here than just simply trying to replace Darrell Taylor, unfortunately.
Well, there's a lot involved here, Corbin. I think that basically what comes down to is that Trevis Gipson, as you said, is essentially a replacement for Darrell Taylor. And I think if you're just looking at it from a pass rushing perspective, when you look at the statistics, then Darrell Taylor has been more productive than Gipson. But as you noted, Gipson is a slightly bigger man, 6'4", 270 pounds. He played as a stand-up outside linebacker, a hand-in-the-dirt defensive end. Hell, he even reduced inside as a defensive tackle, and his tape with the Jacksonville Jaguars over the preseason this year, as well as in his previous stop with the Chicago Bears, shows me a player who has significantly more physicality and just power at the point of attack, awareness, especially in the running game, than Darrell Taylor ever showed. Now, there's a lot of long-time Locked On Seahawks listeners and viewers, and as Corbin often says, thank you so much for all of your support. But you know me, I've been a Darrell Taylor guy for the last 4 years, and I'm telling you, I believe that Trevis Gipson is an upgrade. And so the fact that the Seahawks essentially got them for each other, as you mentioned, basically both 6th-round selections that were swapped, then I think that this is a win for the Seahawks. I think that they are bigger, they're more physical, I think they're more versatile, and kind of like what we talked about sometimes with some of the wide receivers or running backs, and obviously those are players on offense. You kind of know what the Seahawks were going to do when certain running backs or wide receivers are on the field. When Darrell Taylor was on the field, I think that opposing quarterbacks and play callers just checked to a run right at him. And I don't think that you have that possibility here with Trevis Gipson. So again, I really think that this is a good move by the Seahawks. I think it's one that was made a lot of sense considering some of the injury problems that are unfortunately popping up for the club.
Yeah, and that's really the other big story here, because I don't know if this trade happens if Uchenna Nwosu does not sprain his MCL in Saturday's win over the Browns. And you can say what you want. I've gone back and watched the illegal chop block that was made by Wyatt Teller. I don't think there was anything malicious there. Just as a guy that has played a lot of football myself, I don't think Wyatt Teller was trying to take him out of the game and injure him. That being said, I can see why fans and honestly the coaches are in an uproar because the way that it ended up being executed is illegal and the refs got it right calling it. So I guess if you look at it from the bright side, at least it's not a torn MCL. It's not a torn ACL. It's not something that's going to knock Nwosu out for the season. But I don't know that the Seahawks were going to be looking to make this trade when they just got this 6th round pick back for Darrell Taylor from the Chicago Bears. I don't know if it's the same exact 6th round pick, but you're going to get rid of a 6th rounder to bring in Trevis Gipson. I don't know if they are going to make this move if Uchenna Nwosu is healthy going to the start of the regular season. But now you really only have 3 traditional edges because Draymond Jones is not a traditional edge. That does not mean he can't play it effectively. I think in this scheme, he has a chance to be really good. But you have to remember, Draymond Jones has been out almost all of August too. So the depth is a major concern for the Seahawks at that edge position. Now that Nwosu probably is going to end up on injured reserve. The reports today were saying 2 to 6 weeks with an MCL sprain. Based on what I've seen in the past, it depends on the grade of the injury, but I would lean towards probably going to be on the longer side of that before he's back on the field. So you're looking at 4 missed games minimum if he's on injured reserve. You needed to bring in reinforcements, and Gipson, again, is a guy that a couple of years ago had 7 sacks for the Bears. 2 years ago, he only had 3 sacks, but he had 11 quarterback hits. So he's been effective at disrupting quarterbacks, getting into the backfield. Last year, didn't play very much for the Tennessee Titans, only was in 8 games, but when he had his opportunities, he was extremely efficient with his pass rushing chances. So this is a player that's still only 27 years old. He's somebody that the Seahawks had some high marks on in the pre-draft process coming out of Tulsa a few years back. So he's a guy that's been on the radar. The chance to be able to get him for that 6th round pick now, this was a situation where I do think some of that early season desperation, you don't want to get in a position where you're playing with 3 edges. They wanted to be able to make sure that they had somebody else with NFL experience, and hopefully they can get Jamie Sheriff and maybe Nelson Caesar back in the practice squad when they're cut. But those guys are players that they're hoping to continue grooming. They clearly wanted somebody else, though, that's got NFL experience and has been effective at the NFL level, which Gipson certainly has.
Yeah, and again, that's why I think that the move makes sense. Do it now rather than than trying to compete with somebody that might be on the scrap heap and had been released. Because Trevis Gipson was not going to be released by the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Seahawks had to go get him. And so again, as you just said, I think that this is a reflection of the Uchenna Nwosu injury. As I just mentioned, I do believe that Gipson is an upgrade in Mike Macdonald's defense over Darrell Taylor. He is not an upgrade over Uchenna Nwosu. You got to get Nwosu back. We talked, basically ad nauseum over the offseason that what a huge drop off there was in run defense, in particular when Uchenna Nwosu went down a year ago. Trevis Gipson he buys you some time until number 10 is back on the field for the Seahawks. And I'm not one for following players on social media and things like that, but Uchenna Nwosu did put on his social media account the letters BRB. So be right back. Is common explanation for those letters. So I'm expecting that it is, as you said, going to be that 2 to 6 week kind of a layover here, and Uchenna Nwosu should be back on the field for the Seahawks quickly. Now, unfortunately, that's not the only injury news that came out of that preseason week 3 preseason victory over the Cleveland Browns. The nickel cornerback, Artie Burns, who has been absolutely spectacular throughout training camp. Corbin, somebody we've gushed about. His injury looks like it could be more significant. Now, the Seahawks did not make any kind of comments on him, but watching that injury over and over again, it was a non-contact injury, and I am no doctor, but the way he pulled up, like it could be a heel or Achilles, a calf tear, something of that nature that could be, even a season-ending type of an injury. So that is something that I think is going to have some roster ramifications as well.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue going into this next segment when we dish out our final 53-man roster projections on defense. I'm hoping that it's not a significant injury, but anytime that you see a play like that, watching the replay, the way that he just came up non-contact and then getting carted off and he had his shoe and his socks taken off, that is clearly not a good sign. There was some kind of an injury down there. I mean, you're hoping maybe it was a sprained ankle or something, but that's not what it looked like on the replay. It looks like it's more significant. So that is something we should know more about here in the next day or two, especially with roster cuts coming up. If indeed he has a season-ending injury, the Seahawks will, because it does. Because I think, and you would agree with me, I think he is on this football team if he's healthy. He earned that roster spot, and now the Seahawks are without their number 2 slot corner. And again, that's going to open up the door for somebody else. So we're going to have that discussion coming up next. Some injuries changing the game a little bit on defense. Who do Rob and I think are going to make the cut for the Seahawks on their 53-man roster projections? We'll have our final projection coming up next year on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to have as many top-tier candidates as possible to interview. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. As a site manager for Seahawks on SI, LinkedIn Jobs is my go-to to post writing positions to land top candidates, and they made the process easy and seamless. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. It's a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, making it the best place to hire. Hiring is so easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. And that's why they're constantly finding ways to make the process easier. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process quicker. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Welcome back to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it, especially those on YouTube. When we start a few minutes late, hey, look, we got busy lives. We've got traffic in Seattle. We've got jet lag, airplanes landing late. You name it. We appreciate you hanging in a few minutes late to make sure that you check out Locked On Seahawks. And so let's get to our final 53-man roster projections, Rob. And normally this is one segment for us. We just look at offense and we look at defense when we're going through our phase of progressions as far as these projections go. But this is our final one. This is for bragging rights. Who's going to get the most players correct on the 53-man roster? And I feel like it might be a little bit trickier in some senses. It's kind of a double-edged sword. It could be easier in some regards and trickier in some regards with trying to project this defense because of the injuries that we just talked about to Uchenna Nwosu and Artie Burns. I have both these guys starting the season on injured reserve. And unfortunately, with Artie Burns, I'm hoping I'm wrong, but it looked like a season-ending variety of injury to me. Uchenna Nwosu, luckily, it is not that case. He's going to miss 2 to 4 weeks, probably may miss the first 4 games, but I have both these guys starting on injured reserve. So Nwosu would have to miss those first 4, even if he might be ready to play after 2 or 3 games. I think they're going to have to start him on injured reserve, which of course is going to create a roster spot in the short run for somebody else on that defense.
As you said, in the short run, that's one of the adjustments that the NFL has made here in the last couple of years is that you can have 2 players that are put on IR to start the season, and then they can come back after 4 games. So the hope, of course, is Uchenna Nwosu, and perhaps, as you mentioned, Artie Burns might be a candidate for that. I do, like you, I kind of expected this could be a longer-term injury for Artie Burns, but as you said, we both would have anticipated that he would have made this team had he been healthy. I have Uchenna Nwosu, same kind of situation on IR to start the season, but expect him hopefully going to be back after those 4 games. Just looking along the defensive line front, first, Boye Mafe, Draymond Jones, Leonard Williams, Mike Morris, Jonathan Hankins, Jaron Reed, Byron Murphy II, of course, Miles Adams. And I want to kind of stop there for a moment and talk about two of the interior defensive linemen that to me were right on the bubble. And I elected to keep both of them in Mike Morris and in Miles Adams. Miles Adams didn't play a snap in this last preseason game, and I found that interesting. At the same time, we know what he can do. He's demonstrated throughout training camp now, last couple of years, the preseason and the regular season. And as we've talked about before, he's got such a different body type than so many of the other defensive linemen for the Seahawks. But again, I found that fascinating, whereas Mike Morris is on the field almost the entire game and playing so many different roles. And so to me, this is a position of strength for the Seahawks, and I think that they want to keep it as a position of strength because, as we just talked about, with the injury to Uchenna Nwosu and another player that could start the season on IR or the PUP list in the former draft pick from a year ago, the defensive tackle Cameron Young. Finally, those last edge rushers that I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention them would be, again, Uchenna Nwosu there in orange for those of you who are watching on YouTube on that PUP list. The training camp hero that is Derek Hall. And as we talked about just a couple of moments ago, the trade for Trevis Gipson, I believe that he makes this squad immediately. And again, it's going to be playing significant minutes. Rather than go through every single player, I wanted to kind of focus at the linebacker position because that's a spot where you and I are going to have a difference, Corbin. I have the Montana quarterback, Patrick O'Connell, making this squad. And the reason for is because I just believe that he is better in coverage than Michael Barrett, who the Seahawks, of course, made a trade for here recently. Barrett, to me, is a player that I think is a legitimate NFL guy. And I think I would expect either he or O'Connell, if the Seahawks don't decide to keep both of them, then I think that they would want to resign either one of them to their practice squad. For the opponent that's coming up this week, the regular season opener, of course, 2 weeks from now against the Denver Broncos, I just really think that Patrick O'Connell's coverage ability gives him a little bit of an edge on Barrett, even though, again, I like Barrett as well. But otherwise, that's the only real change I have at this point is that I have O'Connell making the squad. He was not on my initial 53-man roster that was released a week ago. The only other one would be DJ James, the rookie nickel cornerback, as we talked about with Artie Burns possibly being injured for a significant amount of time then. And DJ James having a good game this last week against Cleveland.
One heck of a rebound, Rob.
Yeah. And so that to me is all the more reason why we might see that the Seahawks keep both of their drafted corners this year.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you on DJ James. At this point, I don't know who else they would plug in there because Kobe Bryant hasn't been playing the slot cornerback position. Not that he couldn't go back there, but DJ James is next in line with Artie Burns likely to miss at least half the season. If it's a torn calf muscle or something like that, maybe he comes back at some point this year. You'd have to keep him on the roster initially and then put him on injured reserve, which means somebody else is going to have to go on the waiver wire in that case. So again, we don't know what's going on in that front specifics with Artie Burns. It just did not look good. So you and I are both assuming that he starts the year on injured reserve, maybe out for the season. DJ James is going to be the second string slot cornerback and going to be on the field when Devin Witherspoon's playing out wide. So the rookie's going to go from being on the bubble to potentially playing significant snaps for this defense. That's how much this injury to Artie Burns changes things. And then looking at the rest of my defensive projection here, as you mentioned, the other area where you and I have a significant difference, it is the linebacker spot. And the reason that I've got Mike Barrett making this team over Patrick O'Connell, I think Patrick O'Connell is going to be easier to sneak to the practice squad is really my biggest rationale behind this. Barrett was drafted. He's from Michigan. He played for the national champions last year. You just traded a 7th-round pick to get him. I am not turning around a couple days later and cutting him and trying to get him on my practice squad because I think this guy, heck, Carolina could say, oh, he's on waivers. We're just going to get him. We're going to try to sign him back after we just got Mike Jackson from you. So I don't see any way that the Seahawks are going to do that. I think they have a much better chance. Patrick O'Connell has had a really good preseason, but I think that is a player, a former undrafted guy, not as heralded, didn't play in a national championship in the college football playoff like Barrett did. I think that's a guy that is a much better opportunity to get him to the practice squad. So that's my rationale there. But you and I have the same 4 other linebackers, mainly because John Radigan, to me, is still too good of a special teams player. You can't move on from him. Tyrese Knight has gotten better every single week, so I'm excited about that. And then on the outside, I still think D. Williams is your number 2 returner to go with Laviska Shenault, and I think he's your main punt returner. I know D. Eskridge had the 79-yard return the other night, and it was really cool to see that celebrated. But I just think D. Williams has done more overall in this training camp. So I think that D. Williams is still on this roster as that 6th corner and one of your special teams, your return specialist that is going to get a lot of opportunities to make a difference for the Seahawks in the regular season. And up front, you and I are on the same page. I wanted to get Jamie Sheriff on this team because I feel like he has earned an opportunity to be on an NFL roster with the way he's played. But with the trade for Trevis Gipson, I don't see any way that is happening now. They're going to be hoping they can get him back to the practice squad. But overall, you and I are thinking the same page on the defensive line. Big differences. I think Barrett, I just don't see him being a guy. I think it'd be tougher to slip him to the practice squad just because of where he came from. He was a guy that was drafted. I just think that there are other teams that need linebackers. If he becomes available, would have interest. I think O'Connell's going to be easier to be able to slip onto the practice squad. Otherwise, we really are thinking much the same as far as most of the other positions with what has happened from the injury front. When we come back, we are going to shift gears over to the offensive side of the ball as we do our final projections. And offense is really where Rob and I have some significant disagreements that we're going to be discussing. We are going to get to that coming up next here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have something a little different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. With a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game, and all you need is a Google account and a current form of payment. You can cancel at any time. Bet on everything from Geno Smith's MVP odds to Byron Murphy II's chances of winning the first ever Defensive Rookie of the Year award for the Seahawks, or Mike Macdonald winning Coach of the Year. Just throw in a $5 bet and you'll get a 3-week free trial to NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Just visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to download America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. It's your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s who are listening. And thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Dishing out our final 53-man roster projections. The Seahawks tomorrow have to have the roster trimmed from 90 to 53 players. There's a number of mechanisms they can use. Obviously, most of these players are going to hit waivers. There may be some vested veterans that get cut that can sign with any team. They don't go on the waiver wire. And of course, as we talked about with players like Uchenna Nwosu and Artie Burns, they could land on injured reserve, which knocks them out for 4 games minimum and opens up a roster spot for another player. So there's a number of mechanisms at play here. You and I really had basically the same depth chart on defense, except for the linebacker position. But I think there's some significant differences on offense. And I know there's one in particular, Rob, for you that our listeners, they might have some issue with because this player had a really big preseason, especially what he did with a 56-yard run on Saturday night against the Cleveland Browns. But I'm going to give you the mic as to why you decided Kenny McIntosh isn't making this football team.
I just didn't see enough consistently throughout training camp and over the course of the preseason this year. I mean, as you mentioned, Corbin, obviously the 56-yard touchdown run, and it was a great run. The body control, the stiff arm, being able to keep his feet and finish that run. You saw a little bit of juice from him. Look, Kenny McIntosh is a solid back. I just think that there's no question that George Holani has passed him, at least in my opinion. I think that George Holani is the better, more dynamic, make you miss, and also shows more running, just running power and vision. I think he's a more natural runner. I think that he is more physical and reliable in pass protection and as a receiver. And I just have a hard time keeping 4 running backs. To me, it is with all due respect to you as a former running back yourself, I just think it's the easiest position in modern football to replace. And so I just don't have the fear of dropping developing Kenny McIntosh and perhaps him going elsewhere than I would with the George Holani or frankly players at other positions. So you're right. I don't have Kenny McIntosh making the squad. If the Seahawks do in fact decide to keep 4 running backs, I understand the argument. I just disagree.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're taking that stance because me being a running back guy, I am not taking that same stance. I've got these 4 running backs making the football team, and there's a couple of reasons behind this. For one, I do think Kenny McIntosh, the running, what I've been impressed by is the yards after contact, because that has never necessarily been a big part of his game. But we saw quite a bit of that, some really hard running in the preseason. And I also think he's a really good special teams player. Both these guys are. So that's my rationale here. I want those bottom of the roster spots to go to guys who are going to be contributors on special teams. And I still think in a pinch can return kicks. It doesn't look like he's going to be in mix there, but he can tackle. I've seen him do it. He can cover kicks and punts. And George Holani, all he's done in preseason is make tackles and make plays on special teams. And his blocking, I mean, that to me has been the difference. If I had to pick between the two, George Holani is the one I'm keeping because I think George Holani has been the better football player, the better all-around player, and he's a better fit for that third down role. And I'm also going to say this, and this might be behind your rationale too, but I do feel like Kenny McIntosh has had some massive holes to work with in the preseason. Yep. Like that touchdown run. Again, I'm not going to take that away from any running back when that happens. You got to be proud that your O-line did that. But like that was like 2 semis could have fit through that crease. It was huge. George Holani had a couple runs the other night where there was no blocking to speak of, and he turned negative runs into 5-yard gains and an 18-yard gain. That kind of stuff is going to translate more to regular season football. I'm afraid that's the way that I view it. That kind of running style is going to have a better chance against regular season starting defenders to be effective. That being said, I still think both these guys deserve to be on the football team. And then at the receiver position, I do think that gap closed a little bit. There were a few other players that were really pushing Derek Young for that 6th spot, but reading through the tea leaves, I just can't see Mike Macdonald the way that he has gushed about Derek Young. I cannot see them cutting him, and he's just such a good special teams player. And I think he's a guy that in the regular season that Ryan Grubb, if he has to, will find some ways to get him involved on offense too, because he can play a number of different positions. I just still think that Derek Young is number 6, and I just feel like the special teams is a big part of that.
I think the special teams is a significant factor for Cody White as well. And the fact that Cody White has produced more explosive plays when given similar opportunities, for the same reason that there's going to be a lot of people who will be upset that Kenny McIntosh doesn't make the roster, at least in my projection, based on what number 25 did for the Seahawks against Cleveland in the breakaway touchdown. That was one of the most exciting plays of the game. Well, Cody White's done the same thing. I mean, he was, as he showed after making a catch a couple of weeks ago, he was this close to breaking a second big touchdown like this one. And obviously, if all you care about are the statistics, Cody White didn't get the credit for catching that touchdown from Sam Howell because of a holding call against Christian Haynes. And we'll get into the offensive line here in just a moment. But I thought that Cody White's been terrific. I mean, he's been right on the edge for me. And I do believe that he is at least as good of a special teams player as Derek Young is. Now, the height and the speed and all those types of things about Derek Young are absolutely fascinating. But to me, he's still a developmental player. I haven't seen him consistently make people miss or even bowl people over given his size as much as I thought that I would, whereas I've seen Cody White do those things. And so, again, very similar conversation to what we just talked about with George Holani and Kenny McIntosh at running back. I just think that Cody White is right now the better player, and that the practice squad is all about developing unpolished talent, guys like Derek Young, in my opinion. But again, there's no doubt that it would be a risk allowing him to leave to not be on the initial 53. You could get Derek Young stolen, as well as Esau Winston for that matter, getting stolen from another club.
And it's a little easier to get receivers because there's so many of them. It's a lot easier to slip those guys to practice squads. But a player like Derek Young with the traits that he's got. Those kind of players are the ones that other teams start to think, I might want to bring him in and see what I can do developing that player. But White did have a special teams tackle the other night too. So it's not like he has not been effective on special teams in the preseason. He's made plays. He's done some really nice things in the practice field. So I definitely considered him. I just think Derek Young, I just still think he is the number 6 guy there. Now let's talk offensive line. And this is where you and I now are both in agreement. Abraham Lucas, look, could the Seahawks this week activate him from the PUP list? Absolutely. And then that means maybe he plays by week 2 or week 3. But I see no way in a snowball chance in hell that he is playing against the Denver Broncos in week 1. There's no way that he is going to be ready to do that when he hasn't even been activated at this point. And there is a growing sense in me that he's going to miss the first 4 games. So I think him staying on the PUP list is a very real possibility at this stage.
Yeah, that's what it feels like to me as well. And that's why I have him on the PUP list in my, this initial projection. Look, they're kind of like we talked about with Uchenna Nwosu. There's no doubt the Seahawks are a better team when they have Abraham Lucas starting at the right tackle position. But the steady improvement I've seen from McClendon Curtis in particular, the reliability that has been George Fant in the past, the swing tackle positional versatility that Stone Forsythe provides, I think are all reasons why offensive line is a strength for the Seahawks. If you talked about before, Corbin, that John Schneider has already pulled off 4 trades throughout August. If the Seahawks trade anybody else, then I think they could be along this offensive line, especially with Stone Forsythe, just because of the starting experience, George Fant as well. I just think that, again, the veterans there and the fact I think that Seattle is very, very high on the young people that they have there, specifically a guy like Mike Jarrell. Those are the kind of guys that I think allow Seattle a little bit of flexibility here. So I have essentially the same offensive line I had before. And again, if there is some shenanigans that happen in the next 24 hours, I wouldn't be surprised if the Seahawks trade one of their current offensive linemen to some of the other offensive line needy teams throughout the league, whether it be a draft pick, whether it be a player that comes back, maybe it's a nickel corner. Those are some of the positions that I think that the Seahawks are still very much focusing on who's going to be on the waiver wire here shortly.
John Schneider is probably working the phone literally right as we speak here. I'm sure he's talking to somebody about some options with the way that he's been winging and making deals here so far. This was maybe the toughest decision for me on this final 53, and I can't imagine in that tackle position because the Lucas injury adds even more mystery to this. If Abraham Lucas was healthy enough to be activated from the PUP list and at least be on your roster to start the season, then it's possible Stone Forsythe and Mike Jarrell both are not on this football team at the start of the season. Seattle may move forward without either one of them. But if Abe Lucas isn't playing in week 1, which there is no way in my mind that he's going to be ready to play against the Denver Broncos, if he's going to miss at least 1 game, potentially more, at least one of those guys has to be on the roster. And that was the hardest decision for me because I'm looking at it from 2 different perspectives. Stone Forsythe has started quite a few games in the NFL. He's played right tackle and left tackle. He doesn't have the ability to play guard. He can't move inside, but he can play both tackle positions. He had some starts last year where he was pretty effective. There were some games where he really struggled. So you still had young player inconsistency, but I just don't think he's looked very good in this preseason. And in training camp, he was struggling mightily. I just haven't seen a kid that's really taken that next step. And Mike Jarrell, I've been impressed every step of the way. I've seen him win one-on-ones against players like Boye Mafe, like multiple one-on-ones. I thought he was the best lineman on their 3rd string offensive line by a country mile the last couple of preseason games. You see a guy that is getting the job done. No pressures allowed this last game. You can see the athleticism that this kid possesses. So it really boils down to, do you want to keep Forsythe for the experience because you want to have a guy that's available if somehow George Fant gets hurt? You're like, okay, I'm going to slide Forsythe now to right tackle. Or do you want to look at the upside and the fact that Mike Jarrell is on a cheap 6th round pick deal for the next 4 years? Stone Forsythe's in the last year of his contract. So I think there's a number of factors here. And for that reason, I'm keeping Mike Jarrell in this latest projection, this final projection, over Stone Forsythe. I don't have them keeping both. And the big reason why, McClendon Curtis has been playing a lot of right tackle. I list Curtis at guard here, But that's what makes McLennan Curtis, to me, still a lock to make this team, because he can play everywhere except center. And he could probably play center if they gave him a chance to learn how to play it. He's just that versatile. But I think Mike Jarrell, the risk of him getting picked up on another team's roster is too great here. I think you have a better chance of Forsythe sneaking through waivers than you do Mike Jarrell. That's just my opinion from what I've seen, and just the fact that Forsythe is not the athlete. It doesn't have the upside that Mike Jarrell does. So that's where you and I differ. You have both of them making the team. Is it possible that could happen? Sure. But I think there's going to be another couple other positions on offense, just on the offensive side of the ball. Seattle's going to have to make some tough choices with third or fourth tight ends, running backs, whatever they're choosing to do. I don't know they're going to be able to keep that many offensive linemen, but you and I are in agreement. Abe Luke starts the year on the PUP list, and that is going to be another thing that has some major dominoes on this offensive line as they put together this initial 53-man roster. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, we're going to have some Tell the Truth Tuesday. We didn't have Monday musings, but Tell the Truth Tuesday, both looking back at Saturday's game and also telling the truth about the roster cuts that happened on cut down day. Trades potentially as well. There's always the possibility John Schneider will do that again, but we're going to be diving into all the key news on roster cut down day on tomorrow's show. Make sure that you're listening in and enjoy the rest of your Monday night. Go Hawks.